Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
What's going on, good people? You're listening to the Afternoon Praise, and this is Build a Brand Wednesday. And again, I am excited that you made it 2 days through the week. You made it through Monday, you made it through Tuesday, and I know you have executed at a level like never before. I know you set your mind to completing what you put in place. So guess what? I celebrate you today. And today, guess what, people? We are going to continue to build your brand. And here on the Afternoon Praise, I want to keep reiterating this. We are here to help people reach their defined level of success by discovering and developing their gifts. This week, we've been dealing with culture. Monday, we establish what you allow becomes your culture. Tuesday, we exposed red flags don't fix themselves. But today, we go deeper because eventually, those red flags stop being warnings and become the environment itself. And here's the dangerous part. People keep trying to grow in environments that are poisoning them. They keep trying to build, lead, heal, scale, develop, trust, create inside unhealthy atmospheres. Then they wonder why everything feels heavy, why people keep leaving, why growth feels unstable, why they feel emotionally exhausted. Because healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33. Be not deceived. Evil communication corrupts good manners. This scripture is not just about words, people. It's about influence, atmosphere, association, exposure, normalized behavior, because eventually what surrounds you starts shaping you. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Join us on this heavenly journey, one song at a time, Wayvve Radio.
You're tuned in to the Afternoon Praise on this Build a Brand Wednesday, and we are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. See, environment shapes behavior. People love talking about talent, but talent is not enough because talent is a seed. The environment is the soil, and even the strongest seed struggles in toxic soil. This means unhealthy environments distort healthy people. Toxic leadership weakens strong teams. Emotionally unstable systems damage confidence. People do not grow in toxic environments. They adapt to survive. That's why two people can have the same level of talent and produce completely different outcomes depending on the room they are planted in. One environment pulls greatness out of people. Another environment slowly drains it out of them. Healthy environment creates confidence, communication, clarity, collaboration, and accountability. Toxic environments create what? Hesitation, fear, emotional exhaustion, distrust, instability. And eventually people stop operating from purpose and start operating from protection. That's why environment matters more than most people realize, because every environment is shaping behavior, whether intentionally or unintentionally. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
You're riding the waves of faith and grace on Wayvve Radio.
This is Build a Brand Wednesday, and you are tuned in to the Afternoon Praise on Wayvve Radio. And we are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environment. Toxicity change you quietly. I'm going to say that again. Toxicity changes you quietly. This is the dangerous part. Toxicity rarely changes people immediately. It changes them gradually. You start lowering standards. avoiding conflict, becoming emotionally grounded, shrinking your honesty, protecting yourself instead of growing. And after a while, survival becomes normal. That's why people stay in environments that are draining them, because dysfunction slowly becomes familiar. At first, you notice the tension. Then eventually, you normalize it. You start saying, oh, that's just how they are. That's how this place operates. I'm just trying to stay out the way. And that's dangerous, people. Because the moment unhealthy behavior stops shocking you, it starts shaping you. Toxicity changes behavior before people realize it. That's why the scripture says, be not deceived. Because deception happens slowly. You think I'm still the same person, but meanwhile, your patience changed, your communication changed, your trust changed, your energy changed, your outlook changed. And now the environment is quickly rewriting your behavior. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. And let's talk about the environment is training you. Every environment trains behavior. Every room teaches something. Healthy environments teach trust, accountability, communication, safety, and growth. Now let's look at toxic environments. What they teach: fear, silence, politics, manipulation, emotional survival. See, culture silently trains behavior. Even when nobody says anything, people do not just adapt to policies. They adapt to patterns. That means people study what leadership ignores, what behavior gets rewarded, what behaviors get protected, who gets corrected, who avoids accountability. And over time, the room creates its own language. That's why culture is not built during speeches. Culture is built through repetition, through tolerated behavior, through emotional tone, through daily patterns. And eventually, people stop asking what's right and start asking what survives here. That's when the culture becomes dangerous. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise here on Wayvve Radio. And today we are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. Let's look at normalized dysfunction. Normalized dysfunction is dangerous, people. One of the most dangerous phrases in leadership is, that's just how things are here. That normalize what? Dysfunction. Where unhealthy behavior becomes so common, nobody questions it anymore. Now, disrespect becomes normal. Confusion becomes normal. Tensions become normal. Distrust becomes normal. And eventually, dysfunction stops feeling dysfunctional. That's why some organizations become emotionally exhausted, because people have adapted to unhealthy systems for so long, they can no longer recognize healthy behavior. See, chaos feels normal. Stress feels normal. Poor communication feels normal. Broken trust feels normal. And eventually, the environment trains people to expect instability. That's dangerous, because once dysfunction becomes normalized, excellence starts looking unusual. Now, accountability feels offensive. Communication feels threatening. Correction feels personal, because unhealthy environments eventually reject healthy standards. And I'm going to say that again. Unhealthy environments eventually rejects healthy standards. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise here on this Build a Brand Wednesday, and we are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environment. Let's look at toxicity spreads faster than excellence. See, toxicity spreads quickly, faster than discipline, faster than trust, faster than excellence, because humans mirror environments emotionally. Research on emotional contagion shows people subconsciously absorb stress, fear, negativity, anxiety, and instability. That means one toxic person can emotionally contaminate an entire room. One emotionally unstable leader can affect an entire team. One manipulative personality can change the emotional climate of a business. And this is why leadership cannot afford to ignore emotional behavior. Because behavior does not stay contained, it multiplies. People study energy. People absorb tensions. People react to instability. That's why environments matter. And if toxicity spreads faster than excellence, then leaders must become intentional about protecting culture. Because once fear spreads, communication weakens. Once distrust spreads, collaboration weakens. Once negativity spreads, creativity weakens. And eventually, people stop building together and start surviving individually. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.
Welcome to Build a Brand Wednesday. We are midway through the week. I know some of you all call it Hump Day Wednesday, but I want you to change it to Build a Brand Wednesday because I want you to speak into your life, speak into your execution, because you're not on the hump. You are building. This is Build a Brand Wednesday. And we were talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. Leadership sets environmental tones. Leadership is not just direction. Leadership is atmosphere. A leader's mood affects the room. A leader's inconsistency affects the room. A leader's tolerance affects the room. And what leadership tolerates, culture normalizes. Yes, that means your culture is not defined by what you preach. It's defined by the worst behavior you allow consistently. If leadership ignores disrespect, manipulation, dishonesty, instability, and emotional abuse, the room again interprets the silence as approval, because people don't just listen to what leaders say. They study what leaders protect. Leaders is the thermostat. The environment is the temperature. And if the room constantly feels tense, fearful, unstable, emotionally draining, leaders must stop blaming people only and start examining the climate they created. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Bringing the sounds of heaven 24/7, Wayvve Radio.
You're listening to Build a Brand Wednesday here on Wayvve Radio, and I am Demetrius L. Brown, and this is the Afternoon Praise. And I want to thank you for joining me again. Like I always say, you could have been listening to someone else, but you decide to listen to me, Demetrius L. Brown. Let's talk about healthy people become unhealthy in toxic systems. See, this is important. Sometimes the issue is not that people are weak. The system itself is unhealthy. Strong people eventually become exhausted in toxic environments. Creative people stop sharing ideas. Honest people stop speaking up. Passionate people become emotionally numb because fear changes behavior. And eventually people stop growing and start protecting themselves. That's why some people who were once confident, motivated, visionary, optimistic, becomes quiet and disconnected. Not because they lost potential. Nah, that's not the reason. But because the environment trained survival behavior. People cannot flourish in rooms where trust is broken, communication is unsafe, tension is constant, and emotions are weaponized. Eventually, the nervous system shifts from growth mode into defense mode. And once people are emotionally defending themselves, they stop performing at their highest level. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. Let's talk about psychological safety changes everything. See, Google studied high-performing teams for years through Project Aristotle, and the number one factor was not intelligence. It was psychological safety. The ability to speak honestly, make mistakes, communicate openly, disagree without fear. Because growth requires vulnerability, and you cannot grow where trust is consistently broken. People perform differently when they feel emotionally safe. They think clearer, they create better, they communicate healthier, collaborate stronger, but toxic environments create psychological danger. Now people hide mistakes, avoid honesty, suppress ideas, stop asking questions because fear shut down innovation. See, research shows fear activates survival responses in the brain. That means toxic environments literally reduce creativity, strategic thinking, problem solving, innovation. Fear may control people temporarily, but it weakens organizations long term. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Let's talk about toxic environments drain energy. Toxic environments create an energy tax. In healthy environments, energy goes towards growth. In a toxic environment, energy goes towards survival. Now people spend their energy avoiding blame, protecting themselves, managing emotions, navigating politics, staying emotionally safe. That's exhausting. I've been there, done that. People become mentally tired before they even start working because emotionally draining environments force them to constantly monitor tone, reaction, instability, emotional unpredictability. That's why toxic leadership creates burnout so quickly. People are not only working, they are emotionally surviving the room. And eventually, exhaustion affects communication, patience, clarity, confidence, and decision making. Now, people stop operating strategically and start operating emotionally. That's dangerous in leadership and business and in your family and in your ministry and in relationships. Because if I gotta think and exhaust myself to say, okay, before I get with this person, I gotta be this way. Guess what? I'm already exhausted before I became in your presence. So if I have to exhaust myself emotionally just to get in your presence, I got to pull myself away from that toxic environment. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise on this Build a Brand Wednesday, and we are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. Let's talk about high performers. See, high performers, they lead first. Toxic environments create a reverse filter. The healthiest people often lead first. Why? Because healthy people recognize dysfunction quickly. They feel the instability. They sense the lack of trust. They notice the emotional chaos, and eventually they leave. See, while most people benefit from dysfunction, Yes, people do benefit from dysfunction environment. But while people who benefit from dysfunction stay, that's how environments slowly become pools of mediocrity. High performers usually have options, so they refuse to stay where growth is punished, accountability is inconsistent, excellence is attacked, emotional immaturity leads the room, and this is why some organizations slowly lose their strongest people. Not because of money only, because of the atmosphere. People can survive hard work, but constant emotional toxicity eventually push healthy people away. And when healthy people keep leaving, leaders must stop asking, what's wrong with everybody, and start asking, what kind of environment are we creating? And not even we. You need to ask yourself, what type of environment am I creating as the leader? You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise, and this is Build a Brand Wednesday. Let's talk about you can build success and still destroy the environment. This is where many leaders fail. They confuse growth with health. You can make money, you can gain followers, scale quickly, increase visibility, grow a company, build a platform, and still destroy the atmosphere sustaining it. That's dangerous because external success can hide internal dysfunction for a while. From the outside, everything looks impressive, but internally, trust is broken, communication is unhealthy, people are emotionally exhausted, leadership is unstable, culture is deteriorating. That's what happened when companies like Enron and Uber, the system produced growth while simultaneously poisoning the environment. And eventually the toxicity becomes too expensive to hide. That's why leaders must stop measuring health by visibility alone, because growth does not automatically mean the environment is healthy. Sometimes growth is happening while the foundation is quickly cracking underneath it. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise on this Build a Brand Wednesday, and we are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. Let's talk about internal environments matter too. Yes. What are you talking about, D. Brown? I'm glad you asked. Internal, I'm talking about you. Now, let's go deeper, because sometimes the toxic environment is not external, it's internal. Yes, you can carry fear, insecurities, unresolved trauma, perfectionism, scarcity thinking, emotional instability, and create toxicity within yourself. Now, everywhere you go, the environment goes with you. That's why changing locations does not automatically change outcomes. Because if the internal climate remains unhealthy, eventually the same patterns repeat themselves. Some people keep changing jobs, relationships, churches, business partners, cities, but the chaos follows them because toxicity can become internalized. Now, anxiety drives decisions, fear controls communication, insecurity shapes leaderships, emotional wounds distort perception. And eventually people start sabotaging healthy opportunities because dysfunction feels familiar. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Let's talk about you are the one environment you cannot escape. This is a heavy line, people. I want you to stick with me on this one because some of y'all know what I'm talking about. You are the only environment you can never leave. This means if your internal world is chaotic, eventually your external world reflects it. If you are internally at war, eventually your leadership, relationships, and business will feel the effects because unhealthy internal climates eventually leak outwards. People can only fake peace for so long. Eventually, what's happening internally shows up externally in communication, in reactions, in leaderships, in relationships, in emotional patterns. That's why self-awareness matters. Because if you don't confront your internal toxicity, I know that word is my mouth keep getting juicy on that. You will eventually export it into every environment you touch. And this is where many leaders struggle. They want healthy teams while carrying unhealthy internal habits. They want emotionally safe environments while internally operating from fear, ego, insecurity, and emotional pressure. But healthy environments cannot be built from internal toxic foundations. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're tuned in to the Afternoon Praise here on this Build a Brand Wednesday. Let's talk about perfectionism is not always excellence. See, sometimes perfectionism is toxicity disguised as standards, because perfectionism often comes from fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not being enough. Now, people stop innovating, stop risking, stop trying because they are trying to protect themselves emotionally. And environments driven by fear eventually suffocates creativity. See, perfectionism creates pressure without peace. Now, mistakes feels dangerous, vulnerability feels unsafe, learning feels embarrassing, growth feels emotionally threatening. That's not excellence. That's emotional survival disguised as standards. Unhealthy environments understand growth requires process. Healthy leaders understand people learn through correction. But toxic perfectionism creates environments where people becomes afraid to think, speak, or create. And once fear dominates the room, innovation dies. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown. Hey, I know you probably hear my mouth is juicy. My mouth just be getting watery when I be speaking, saying words, and it be just chopping my words up sometime. But you know what? I am working on that. I'm finding something to help me when I do these shows. But I thank you for just sticking with me, being here with me as I work on myself. Okay, let's talk about guard the atmosphere. You got to guard your atmosphere. Leaders must become protectors of atmosphere, not just producers of results, because atmosphere affects communication, confidence, trust, creativity, growth, and execution. You are not just building a brand, you are building an environment people have to live in emotionally. That responsibility matters because people remember how environments made them feel. They remember whether they felt safe, whether they feel heard, whether they felt valued, whether they could grow honestly, whether they constantly had to survive emotionally. Healthy environments produce stability, trust, accountability, communication, stability. Toxic environments produce fear, burnout, silence, confusion, emotional exhaustion, and eventually the atmosphere becomes stronger than the strategy because strategy moves at the speed of trust. If trust is broken, guess what? Everything slows down. That's why leadership is not only about performance, it's about stewardship of the emotional climate. You're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I'm your host, Demetrius L. Brown.
Catch the wave. You're listening to Wayvve Radio, your home for uplifting gospel music.
You're listening to the Afternoon Praise on this Build a Brand Wednesday. We are talking about healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. And my time is up. I thank you for joining me. But let me leave you with this. Let's look at Proverbs 4, verse 23. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Everything flows from the environment. Your words, your leadership, your decisions, your relationships, your culture. Healthy things cannot grow in toxic environments. Not your business, not your teams, not your families, ministries, not people. And maybe the reason things keep breaking is not because the seed is bad. Maybe the soil is unhealthy. Maybe the atmosphere itself needs healing. Because growth is not sustained by talent alone. Growth is sustained by healthy environments. And before you blame your team, your audience, your staff, your family, your organization, stop and examine the climate. Examine yourself. Because people adapt to the environments they survive in. And if the atmosphere is unhealthy long enough, eventually even healthy people begin operating unhealthy. That's why leadership must protect culture aggressively. That's why environments matter. That's why trust matter. That's why emotional health matters. Because what surrounds people eventually shapes people. Listen to what I'm saying. You are not just responsible for results. You are responsible for the atmosphere producing those results. And if healthy things are struggling to grow around you, don't just inspect the seed, inspect the soil. Hey, you're listening to the Afternoon Praise. I thank you for joining me on today. I will catch you tomorrow on Thrive Thursday. I am out of here. Peace.
Stay tuned and stay blessed here on Wayvve Radio.